Hi, I'm Tessa from Brainrot News with a few bits of history for you to choke on so you can digest how we got to this point.
Brainrot the news.
Blood money and the invisible handjob. This is a place where free trade means multinational corporations are free to exploit, pillage, and offshore your job to Bangladesh, while tariffs are dusted off like grandpa's racist heirlooms whenever a politician needs to look tough on China or give Boeing a slappy kiss. If you thought economics was a quiet debate over supply and demand curves, think again. It's more like an endless knife fight in a locked room where the rich keep changing the rules and the poor keep bleeding. Tariffs, in this grotesque carnival, are the spiked bats of economic policy handed out to protect fragile egos, line donor pockets, or occasionally support American workers, or more accurately, support corporate stock buybacks. Today, we dive face first into the swirling cesspool that is U.S. tariff policy, a centuries-long carnival of grift, hypocrisy, backroom deals, and bipartisan economic violence. It's the story of rich men playing God with your prices while insisting it's all for your own good, Congress auctioning off tariff lines like beanie babies on eBay, and you, the voter, the consumer, the meat puppet, left footing the bill. Let's begin. Part 1. The Founding Frauds. Let's roll the clock all the way back to the 1600s when America wasn't even America yet, just a collection of soggy colonies clinging to the Atlantic seaboard like barnacles on the armpit of empire. Back then, Britain ran the show under the grand imperial logic of mercantilism, an economic system that can be boiled down to colonies exist to make the mother country richer, shut up and pay your damn taxes. Under mercantilism, Britain slapped tariffs, duties, and trade restrictions on everything. The colonies were supposed to export raw materials like tobacco, cotton, timber, and import finished goods from England. You want Dutch cloth or French wine? Tough luck, you're buying British. Why? Because London said so, and because tariffs made non-British goods more expensive than a dueling pistol made of diamonds. Fast forward to the mid-1700s, and American colonists are getting testy. They're growing wealthy, at least the white landowners are, but Britain keeps bleeding them dry. The Navigation Acts, Sugar Act, and Stamp Act were each a new way to say, pay us or else. And what was the else? Well, let's just say it involved redcoats and muskets. Tariffs and taxes became the economic fuel behind the ideological fire of revolution. No taxation without representation wasn't a TikTok slogan, it was the real deal, and it was about much more than stamps and sugar. It was about control, whether you got to decide your own economic fate or whether some powdered wig sociopath in London got to dictate it for you. Cue the American Revolution, a bloody tantrum that was, in large part, a trade war in red and blue uniforms. And when the colonies won and declared themselves a real country, they were left with a big shiny problem. How do you fund a new government without a king or empire backing you up? The answer? Tariffs, baby. The fledgling United States was broke, like rummaging through the couch cushions broke. The Articles of Confederation gave the federal government all the authority of a substitute teacher on their first day. States had their own currencies. There was no national army. British creditors were lurking in the financial shadows like repo men. Something had to give. So then came Alexander Hamilton, the original Wall Street hype man, and the founding father most likely to carry a copy of The Economist and a flintlock pistol. As the first Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton looked at America's patchwork economy and said, we need revenue, we need industry, and we need to stop acting like backwater pig farmers. So in 1791, Hamilton dropped his report on manufacturers like a mixtape from hell. He envisioned an America not just growing tobacco and selling furs, but actually building stuff, ironworks, textiles, and factories, an industrial nation. To get there, he proposed a high protective tariff, a paywall around the American economy. Foreign goods, jack up the price. Domestic production, subsidize the hell out of it. But Hamilton's vision didn't land in a vacuum. It landed in the middle of an existential brawl between northern industrial wannabes and southern plantation aristocrats who didn't want anything getting in the way of their slave-powered cotton cash machine. The South hated tariffs. But why? Because they didn't make stuff. They exported raw goods and brought back fancy imports. A tariff meant paying more for British finery and pissing off the very European markets that bought their cotton. So while Hamilton was scribbling economic fan fiction about American factories, southern elites were polishing their monocles and drafting angry letters about tyranny. The Tariff Act of 1789 passed anyway, becoming the first real national revenue stream. It was relatively modest, more about funding the government than shielding American industry, but it set a precedent. The federal government could now tax imports, and that power was going to grow. Over the next few decades, tariffs became the backbone of federal revenue. There was no income tax yet, no IRS knocking on your door. The government got its cash by making imported goods more expensive, which means the poor paid more just to live, while the rich kept lobbying for protection of of their precious industries. By the 1820s, the tariff debate had mutated into full-blown partisan warfare. The North wanted higher tariffs to protect its fragile industries. The South wanted low tariffs to protect their slave-powered export economy. Sound familiar? It's the blueprint for every economic fight America's ever had. Who pays, who profits, and who gets to write the rules. Then came 1828, and with it the infamous Tariff of Abominations. That's not just like some edgy nickname I made up, it's what they called it at the time. It jacked up tariffs to record levels, especially on raw materials like wood and iron, goods the South relied on but didn't produce. It was a direct hit to the Southern economy, and they knew it. So what did the North get? Protected industries, more jobs, the beginnings of the Rust Belt in utero. The South got higher prices, a sense of betrayal, and the creeping realization that the federal government was no longer operating in their favor. The stage was set for nullification, for sectional crisis, and for a civil war that had already been humming in the baseline. So before the Civil War, before Fort Sumter, before Lincoln's stovepipe hat entered the frame, tariffs were already driving a wedge through the heart of the Republic, not because of the policy itself, but because of what it represented: power, money, and who got to wield both. Part 2. Nullification Nation. So, the Tariff of Abominations passed in 1828. It was one of the greatest political middle fingers ever handed down from Washington. Officially, it was a protective tariff meant to guard budding northern industries from British imports. Unofficially, it was a grenade lobbed into the economic heart of the South. This wasn't a simple import tax, it was a message. The federal government was here to play favorites, and the North was holding the controller. The South, especially South Carolina, lost its damn mind. And who was leading the charge? John C. Calhoun, the patron saint of states' rights and aristocratic plantation cosplay, a man who could write a treatise on liberty while owning people like cattle. Calhoun decided that if the federal government passed a law a state didn't like, the state could just nullify it, erase it, ignore it, pretend it didn't exist. His weapon of choice? Constitutional wordplay and the sheer weight of his powdered wig ego. So in 1832, South Carolina declared the federal tariff null and void within state borders. That's not policy disagreement, that's a secessionist dress rehearsal. This wasn't just about wool and iron duties, it was the economic equivalent of drawing pistols at the family dinner. The nullification crisis wasn't about taxes, it was about who held the reins of national power. It was about whether a slave-holding aristocracy could veto democracy at any time it felt slightly inconvenienced. Then came Andrew Jackson, war hero, populist strongman, genocidal maniac. A man so allergic to being challenged that he wants to beat a would-be assassin with his cane. Jackson was no friend to abolitionists or Native Americans, but when it came to the Union, he was all in. He saw South Carolina's nullification tantrum as a direct threat to federal authority. So he responded with the Force Bill of 1833, which basically said, yeah, I can send the army to collect tariffs if you piss me off enough. South Carolina blinked. Calhoun retreated into his parlor to write another 40,000 words on how tyranny is when rich white men don't get their way. Congress, always eager to split the baby, passed a compromise tariff to lower the rates over time. Crisis averted, for now, but the real takeaway was clear. Tariffs were now a frontline issue in the war over federal versus state power, with slavery lurking in the background like the horror villain it always was. For the next few decades, tariff debates turned into America's favorite contact sport. Every time Congress brought up trade policy, it devolved into a screaming match between North and South. Northerners, building steam-powered factories and sweating through early capitalism, loved tariffs. Tariffs protected their ironworks, their textiles, their profits. They wanted a self-sufficient industrial America where you made your own goods and didn't have to rely on British imports. Makes sense if you're the one doing the industrializing. Southerners, on the other hand, saw tariffs as pure Yankee tyranny. Their economy was export-driven, King Cotton baby, and reliant on imports of finished goods. Tariffs made those imported goods more expensive and threatened foreign retaliation. Europe bought a lot of Southern cotton, but if tariffs made US goods too expensive, Europe could retaliate with their own tariffs, tanking the Southern economy. So to the Southern elite, every protective tariff looked like economic sabotage. And I mean, it wasn't just about cloth and iron. This was about cultural and economic dominance of a region that still thought aristocracy was a good idea. Southern plantation owners weren't just pissed about tariffs. They were pissed that the North was growing faster, building railroads, attracting immigrants, and industrializing. They were stuck in a feudal economy, and every federal economic policy that didn't prop up their plantation lifestyle felt like a declaration of war. As the 1850s rolled in, the tariff debate became one more log on the bonfire of national disunion. Alongside slavery, territorial expansion, fugitive slave laws, and the balance of power in the Senate, tariffs stood as another bitter fault line. Then came Abraham Lincoln, elected in 1860 with a platform that included, you guessed it, protective tariffs. He didn't just run on abolishing slavery in the territories, he ran on the idea that tariffs would fund internal improvements like canals, roads, and railroads. Infrastructure that just so happened to benefit the North and Midwest far more than the South. In the Southern imagination, this was Yankee economic imperialism, a double punch of moral condemnation and fiscal domination. So no, tariffs didn't cause the Civil War, slavery did. But tariffs were the economic language of the deeper cultural fight. The South saw Lincoln's platform as a direct threat, not just to slavery, but to their entire way of life, their aristocratic stranglehold on power, their ability to exploit labor, enslaved and otherwise, without interference, and Lincoln's election was the final straw. So South Carolina seceded, first out the gate, just like during the Nullification crisis, except this time there was no compromise tariff, no force bill bluff. This time it was war. Tariffs were never just about trade. They were about control, about who got to write the rules of the American economy, about who had to pay and who got to profit. And in the antebellum United States, that line ran right down the Mason-Dixon and all the way to Fort Sumter. Part 3. Gilded Age Grift-a-Palooza. So the North wins the Civil War. Slavery is abolished, technically, and the South is left smoldering in ruins while the Union turns its blood-soaked gaze toward the next great American tradition, industrial capitalism on steroids. Next came the more ill tariff in 1861, a pre-war baby that bloomed into a post-war monster. It jacked up rates to levels that made pre-war tariffs look like clearance sales. Their idea was simple: keep foreign competition out and fatten up domestic industries, especially the ones that churned out steel, coal, textiles, and weapons. Tariffs soared, and the government, bloated from wartime spending, got hooked on this new sugar rush of indirect revenue. No messy income tax, yet no need to explain fiscal policy to voters. Just make everything cost more and tell the rubes it's for national prosperity. Buy American or starve, but pay more while you're at it. This is when the Republican Party, which once had the decency to oppose slavery, transformed into the sugar daddy of corporate America. No longer the party of Lincoln, more like the party of Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan, and Rockefeller. The elite industrialist class ran the show, and the tariff system was their favorite tool in the chest. Here's the basic grift. Tariffs were supposedly there to protect American jobs. In practice, they protected profits, inflated prices, and screwed over consumers, especially the working class. The government wasn't just letting the market play out, it was tilting the entire table toward the big boys. Do you want to import cheaper wool, tin, or sugar? Too bad. We've got a lobbyist from every one of those industries stuffing congressional pockets like they're playing Monopoly with real people's livelihoods. The infant industry argument was still the go-to excuse. We must protect our young industries from foreign competition. They said this for decades, long after those so-called infants had become gargantuan corporate empires with monopoly power and blood on their hands. At a certain point, you gotta admit the infant is now a full-grown warlord. The McKinley Tariff of 1890 jacked up the average duty to nearly 50%, one of the highest peacetime tariff rates in U.S. history. It covered everything from textiles to tin plates to the shoelaces on your own damn boots. It was the ultimate corporate giveaway. A legal wall that locked in monopoly prices and forced Americans to buy overpriced domestic goods whether they wanted to or not. And guess what? People noticed. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. The 1890 midterms were a bloodbath for the GOP. They lost over 90 seats in the House. But just like a cockroach in a tuxedo, William McKinley scurried back in 1896, this time as a presidential candidate, pushing high tariffs like a used car salesman with a quota. He had the full backing of industrial titans like Rockefeller and Carnegie, who didn't just support him ideologically, they financed him like a startup with a guaranteed monopoly. So McKinley wins, tariffs stay, prices remain high, and corporate America throws a victory party that lasts another generation. But out on the plains and prairies, American farmers are getting absolutely obliterated. They're forced to buy farm equipment and manufactured goods at inflated tariff-protected prices while selling their grain and cotton into glutted, underpaid global markets. It's the worst of both worlds. Pay more, earn less. The farmer became the collateral damage of America's protectionist love affair. Out of this agony emerged the populist movement, a ragtag coalition of agrarians, laborers, and progressives who were sick of being bent over by railroads, banks, and tariff policy. They demanded a radical overhaul, lower tariffs, railroad regulation, currency reform, and democracy that actually worked for regular people. The populists weren't perfect, let's not kid ourselves. There was plenty of racism and reactionary garbage in the mix, but their economic analysis was dead on. They saw the tariff system for what it was, a legalized extraction transaction machine, transferring wealth upward while hiding behind flags and buzzwords. And Congress? Oh, Congress was a swamp before it was cool. Tariff legislation became a high-stakes auction where industries would send in their hired goons, lobbyists, to bid for protective rates. Sugar gets a tariff, wool gets a tariff, tin, iron, chemicals, you name it got a special clause. The tariff schedule read less like policy and more like a bribe ledger. A congressional ear could be bought for the price of a nice dinner and a campaign contribution. There were no regulatory bodies, no ethics committees with teeth, and definitely no shame. Even progressive voices in this era, like William Jennings Bryan, the Cross of Gold guy, centered tariff reform as a moral crusade because it wasn't just about economics, it was about fairness. Tariffs were the disguised class war, an extra tax on the people least able to pay, all to enrich the monopolists least in need of protection. By the early 1900s, cracks started to show. Public anger was rising. Muckraking journalists exposed the sausage-making of tariff legislation, the corruption, the revolving door between industry and Congress. The progressive era had arrived, and with it came calls for real tax reform, not just tweaks to the tariff code, but the introduction of an entirely new system, one that could actually tax wealth and not just consumption. That's when the seeds were planted for the next revolution, the income tax, which would come crashing in by 1913 and change everything. But in the Gilded Age, it was tariffs all the way down, and if you couldn't afford a coat in the winter, well, that's just the price of patriotism, pal. Part 4, the Income Tax Revolution. Then came 1913, a year of miracles and nightmares depending on how much money you had stuffed under your monocle. After over a century of arguing, protesting, and occasionally threatening to secede over how Uncle Sam should fund his ever-expanding empire, the US finally said, you know what, maybe robbing people at the border isn't the most elegant solution. Then we got the 16th Amendment, the one that legalized the federal income tax and forever changed the game. No longer would the government rely solely on tariffs to fill its coffers. Now it could just reach into your wallet directly, like a pickpocket in a suit. And surprise, this wasn't some radical socialist fever dream. It was passed with broad support, even among some business elites who were sick of unstable revenue and preferred a more modern approach to taxation. Of course, they assumed they could rig the system later, and while they weren't wrong, that same year, the Revenue Act of 1913 landed like a thunderclap. Tariffs were slashed across the board, especially on consumer goods, and a modest income tax was imposed on the wealthiest Americans. Emphasis on modest. We're talking 1% on income over $3,000, which was really decent money back then, and a maximum rate of 7% on incomes over $500,000. To most Americans, this was a theoretical tax on guys named Cornelius who lived in castles. Naturally, the robber barons lost their goddamn minds. They wailed into their top hats, clutched their monocles, and began funding think tanks to explain why taxing the rich was somehow un-American. How dare the government stop using poor people's consumption as a piggy bank, and targeting the unearned wealth? Outrageous! But somehow, the reform held. For the first time, the federal government had a stable, progressive revenue stream, one that didn't require torching trade relationships or punishing working-class families for buying foreign shoes. This was a quiet revolution, not just in how revenue was raised, but in who bore the burden. Unfortunately, World War I came along, and with it, the federal budget ballooned like a ticker tape parade on steroids. Suddenly, the government needed real money, fast. Tariffs were hiked again, because of course they were, but income taxes did the heavy lifting. The top rate went from 7% to a brain-melting 77% by the end of the war. Yes, 77%. And somehow, though, the Republic did not collapse. This was peak patriotic sacrifice energy. The rich grumbled, but mostly paid up, and tax revenue flowed in. For a moment, the United States was experimenting with something radical, redistribution that didn't involve burning down towns. But like all good things in America, it didn't last. A few years after the war ended, the 1920s came in like a libertarian fever dream. Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge rolled into office backed by oil barons and anti-tax ideologues who thought the government should be small enough to drown in bathtub gin. They slashed income taxes across the board, especially for the rich, because trickle-down economics hadn't been thoroughly debunked yet, and whittled the top rate down to 25% by 1925. They claimed it was about growth and efficiency. In reality, it was a grand old redistribution from bottom to top, and despite slashing tariffs again in the mid-1920s, their laissez-faire fantasy created a bubble economy built on cheap credit, deregulation, and stock market cocaine. You could get rich by flipping real estate or buying stocks on margin. What could possibly go wrong? Well, 1929 came and the bubble popped like an over-leveraged champagne cork. Enter Smoot-Hawley, aka the worst economic decision of the interwar period, and that's saying something. In 1930, with the economy already in freefall, Congress decided to double down on stupid. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods. Their reasoning? Protect American jobs by making foreign goods more expensive. The result? Global retaliation, collapsing exports, and a world economy that nosedived straight into hell. It was the legislative equivalent of setting your house on fire because it was cold. Everyone hated it. Economists, farmers, trading partners, even some businesses that begged Congress not to pass it. But it didn't matter. Bipartisan idiocy carried the day. Both parties wanted to do something, and as usual, something meant jacking up tariffs and praying it worked. Spoiler, it didn't. As the Great Depression deepened, international trade ground to a halt. Exports dropped by over 60%, unemployment soared, and Smoot-Hawley became a global punchline, a cautionary tale for future generations that they would absolutely ignore again in the 21st century. Then, at long last, came FDR, elected in 1932 by a landslide of people who were tired of living in shantytowns and eating boot soup. Roosevelt took one look at the tariff system and said, no thank you. Through the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934, Roosevelt and his brain trust changed the game. Instead of having Congress micromanage every tariff rate like it was a medieval guild charter, the president was now empowered to negotiate bilateral trade deals. Tariffs were lowered in exchange for reciprocal concessions, and for the first time, trade policy became flexible, strategic, and, dare I say, functional. This wasn't just about economics, it was about politics. FDR needed to rebuild the economy without blowing up the budget, and lowering tariffs helped expand markets for American goods without slamming the poor with indirect taxes. It also helped the United States build alliances and carve out a leadership role in global trade before World War II reshuffled the entire deck. So the result? Slowly, painfully, the economy began to recover, not just because of tariffs, but because America finally started treating economic policy like a tool instead of a weapon. And so the age of high tariffs ended, sort of. They'd come back, of course, like a bad rash or a Bush presidency, but for now, the income tax reigned supreme, and the tariff had been tamed. The government had discovered something wild, that taxing wealth was more efficient, more stable, more just than gouging the working class for buying imported jam. The revolution was here, for now. Part 5. Post-war trade liberalization and the Rust Belt funeral. After World War II, the United States emerged like the only sober guy at a global house party that just burned to the ground. Europe was rebel. Japan was radioactive. The USSR was busy turning Eastern Europe into its own personal escape room. And the United States? Oh, we were just sitting pretty, with half the world's industrial capacity, a military on steroids, and a domestic economy that hadn't been carpet-bombed into the Stone Age. This gave us not just the power, but the gall to start preaching the virtues of free trade, our version of it, of course. You see, we didn't so much practice what we preached as we performed a sleight of hand trick. With one hand, we signed onto the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1947, pledging to reduce trade barriers in the name of global prosperity. With the other hand, we shoveled billions of dollars into our own industrial base through subsidies, tax breaks, and contracts fattened by Cold War paranoia. Free trade for thee, but corporate welfare for me. Then came the Marshall Plan, a $13 billion Help Europe Rebuild initiative, which just so happened to double as a way to secure loyal markets for American exports and keep European socialism from spreading faster than McCarthy's paranoia. We sent over money, machines, and plenty of moralizing. In return, we got allies who bought our stuff and didn't fall in love with the hammer and sickle. Everyone wins, right? Except maybe the American worker who didn't realize the golden age had an expiration date. Back home, the 1940s through early 60s were what economists now call the Trant Gloriouses, 30 glorious years of post-war growth. American factories were running hot. Unions actually had teeth, and CEOs hadn't yet figured out they could make more money firing everyone and outsourcing the rest to a sweatshop. This was the illusion of shared prosperity. Blue-collar workers bought homes, sent kids to college, and maybe even took a vacation once a year. This was a time when a single income could support a family of 4 and still leave room for a Ford, a fridge, and a future. We told ourselves this was capitalism at its best, but what it really was capitalism with training wheels, propped up by protectionism, regulation, and a carefully curated world built in our post-war dominance. But like every American dream, this one was built on a ticking clock. By the 1970s, those golden gears started grinding to a halt. While GATT rounds continued shaving down tariffs like they were sculpting Mount Globalization, American corporations began quietly moving production overseas. Why pay a union welder in Cleveland a living wage when you could pay a child in Jakarta a handful of rice and a promise not to bomb their village? And let's not forget the role of Nixon killing the Bretton Woods system in 1791, untethering separating the dollar from gold and plunging the world into currency chaos. Suddenly, it wasn't just goods that were floating around the world, it was entire industries. Capital became borderless, labor didn't. Guess who got screwed? By the late 70s, the industrial heartland, the engine that won the war and built the middle class, started turning into an open-air museum of shattered promises. Detroit, once the crown jewel of American manufacturing, became a case study in decline. Pittsburgh, the steel titan, was gutted like a fish. Entire towns were flattened, not by bombs, but by balance sheets. They called it deindustrialization, but that's the sterile term. What it really meant was that millions of working-class families watched their livelihoods vanish because some McKinsey ghoul with an MBA found a cheaper way to make widgets. In DC, both parties chanted the mantra of comparative advantage like it was scripture. Sure, we lose a few factories, they said, but look at how cheap your toaster is now, as if anyone built a life around toasters. The Democrats, once the party of labor, got drunk on neoliberal Kool-Aid and decided their new base would be knowledge workers and coastal professionals. The Republicans, they clung to trickle-down economics like a life raft, deregulating everything in sight while selling off the New Deal brick by brick. And while they bickered, corporations raked it in. CEO pay skyrocketed. Stock buybacks became the new national pastime. And the same companies that once stood as pillars of American prosperity now existed only as logos and shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Unions? Crushed. Wages? Stagnant. Environmental standards? Outsourced. The Rust Belt didn't just die, it was executed, slowly and painfully, while the political class argued over the best way to hold the gun. And so, the age of American manufacturing ended not with a bang, but with the whimper of a call center employee asking if you've tried turning it off and on again. Part 6. Trump, Biden, more Trump, and the art of the tariffficial war. Welcome to the modern era, where economic policy is announced via Twitter meltdowns, memes, and press conferences that feel like hostage videos. This is the era where tariffs, the dusty relics of 19th century economic nationalism, got dragged out of the crypt, rebranded as tough love, and weaponized as a blunt force populist cudgel by a man whose understanding of global trade could fit inside of a Cracker Jack box. Enter Donald J. Trump, 2016. The self-declared tariff man, that's not a joke, he called himself that multiple times, in public, with cameras rolling. Trump didn't just bring tariffs back, he mainlined them into the American bloodstream like economic fentanyl. In his mind, the US wasn't running a trade deficit because of structural shifts in global manufacturing or decades of bipartisan neoliberal policy. No, it was because the other countries were laughing at us, cheating us, and winning. All crimes punishable, apparently, by jacking up import taxes on Canadian aluminum. Trump's trade war started with China, because what better way to solidify your tough guy image than by poking the world's second largest economy with a tariff-shaped stick. He imposed levies on hundreds of billions in Chinese goods, everything from industrial components to toys to consumer electronics. China retaliated, as anyone with a brain could have predicted, and soon we were locked in a tit-for-tat tariff brawl that did nothing to bring back jobs but managed to torch American agriculture, spike prices, and send manufacturers scrambling like cockroaches under a Walmart light. Farmers, squeezed by the retaliatory tariffs, were handed billions in subsidies, corporate welfare dressed up as patriotism. Soybeans rotted in silos, supply chains snarled. American consumers paid more. Economists yelled into the void. Trump declared victory anyway. And when the pandemic hit in 2020, things got even dumber. Instead of rethinking trade policy in the face of a global economic collapse, Trump doubled down. He pushed Buy American orders like they were holy scripture, while US businesses begged for access to global supply chains that had been reduced to chaos and back orders. Tariffs stayed, prices rose, the deficit ballooned anyway. But hey, he said China in a mean voice, so the base ate it up. Then it's 2021. Here comes Joe Biden. Surely you thought the self-styled adult in the room would roll back Trump's toddler with a blowtorch trade policies, right? Wrong. Biden took one look at the pile of smoldering tariffs, nodded solemnly, and said, let's just keep the fire going, but maybe wear suits while doing it. He kept Trump's China tariffs, not because they worked, they very much didn't, but because removing them would look weak on China, and Democrats would rather choke on a bad policy than hand Republicans a Fox News chyron that says Biden surrenders to Beijing. Political optics won again, economics lost again. Biden wasn't entirely asleep at the wheel, though. His administration launched something Trump never could have dreamed of: actual industrial policy. The Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and massive clean energy investments. Real attempts to reshore manufacturing and compete with China, not by screaming, but by building. Steelworkers didn't get tweets, they got factory incentives. It was FDR cosplay, sure, but at least the costume fit better. The Trump-era tariffs were still still there. Even when inflation started hitting like a brick through a window, even when American families were budgeting like wartime peasants, Biden clung to those tariffs like they were his magical aviator glasses of courage. It wasn't about what worked, it was about what looked tough. We live in the era of vibes-based governance, where removing a failed policy is politically riskier than maintaining a smoldering dumpster fire. Now, it's 2025, and surprise, somehow, Trump is back, like the herpes you get from a golden toilet. On January 20th, 2025, Trump is sworn in for his second term, looking like a bloated Bond villain who just won a country in a poker game. In his inaugural address, wedged between his promises to declare a national emergency at the border, take the Panama Canal, and rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, he promised to tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens, which is code for strap the US economy to a rocket and see where it crashes. He paints a glorious vision where every problem from inflation to erectile dysfunction is solved by punishing imports until they beg for mercy. Barely a week into the job, Trump starts lobbing economic threats like they're baseballs at a carnival booth. Via Truth Social and a sweaty press briefing next to a golden eagle statue, he vows steep tariffs on key trade partners, which is MAGA speak for anyone who doesn't personally flatter me. He doesn't announce specifics, just enough to make international markets flinch and send economists reaching for their stress balls. By February 1st, 2025, Trump makes it real. He signs an executive order under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a law meant for actual emergencies, not ego meltdowns. The order slaps a 10% tariff on Chinese imports and a 25% tariff on goods from Mexico and Canada. The justification? National security, because apparently avocados and Canadian maple syrup now pose existential threats. It's protectionism with a shotgun and a blindfold. The international blowback is immediate. Mexico and Canada respond with the diplomatic equivalent of, "Are you serious right now?" Leaders from both countries remind Trump that tariffs are a two-way street and gently suggest he stop lighting matches in the fireworks factory. China announces 15% tariffs on US coal and liquefied natural gas, as well as a 10% tariff on crude oil and agricultural machinery, large displacement cars, and pickup trucks, set to take effect the month after. After a weekend of golf and reportedly yelling at his television, Trump agrees to a 30-day pause on the Canada and Mexico tariffs, because even he knows that crashing NAFTA 2.0 before Valentine's Day might look bad on Fox News. The next month, at the same time China's tariffs targeting the United States go into effect, Trump also announces a 25% tariff on all the steel and aluminum imports into the country. The month after, Trump once again announces 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, this time with some exceptions, and an additional 10% tariff on Chinese imports, bringing the total to 20%, which China counters the same day with a 10 to 15% tariff on US agricultural imports. Trump then announces 25% tariffs on automobiles and auto parts to take place in April and May, respectively. April 2nd became what he would refer to as Liberation Day, complete with flags, eagles, a blaring Lee Greenwood remix, and a speech so jingoistic it could make the statues in the National Mall wince. From the Rose Garden, surrounded by sycophants and confused garden staff, Trump unveils his masterstroke in economic aggression, an executive order he describes as historic. No one asks him if he's read a history book. Here's what's in it: a baseline universal tariff of 10% on all imports, no matter where they come from, except Canada and Mexico, who get a slap on the wrist instead of a punch to the jaw thanks to exemptions buried in the USMCA. A special reciprocal tariff rate slapped on 60 countries Trump accuses of getting rich at our expense. Countries on that list include China, Germany, Vietnam, and somehow New Zealand. For these countries, the baseline 10% is deducted from the reciprocal tariff rate to find their effective tariff rate. Trump promises this will rebirth American industry. The crowd claps, the Dow Jones shudders, and the rest of the world starts sharpening its knives. The next day, China imposes a tariff rate of 34% on all US imports, matching the reciprocal rate Trump had placed on them. Trump threatens to retaliate if China refuses to back off, raising their tariff rate to 104% the day after. In retaliation, China raises the US tariff rate to 84% less than a week later, after markets start behaving like a haunted roller coaster and foreign leaders begin treating Trump like an economic arsonist. The White House does what it does best: improvises with a straight face. Trump, now in full master strategist mode, announces a 90-day pause on the reciprocal tariffs, but only for the countries that haven't retaliated yet. The logic? We're rewarding good behavior, says House Education and Workforce Committee Representative Burgess Owens, as if international trade is preschool. The only nation excluded from this temporary peace offering? China, because in Trump's mind, China is somehow the bad guy in the room. Instead of a break, China gets hit harder, with tariffs escalating to a bone-crushing 145%, because winning trade wars, I guess, is punching yourself in the wallet. China, in turn, raises their US tariffs to 84%, essentially turning American ports into ghost towns for Chinese goods. As the 90-day pause unfolds, Beijing punches back with 125% tariffs on US exports, including agriculture, tech, and anything with a flag on it. The soybean industry cries in tariffs. Diplomatic talks are set to resume, but it's less negotiation and more threat exchange. Trump's team teases the possibility of lifting tariffs if nations agree to a new bilateral deal, essentially trying to bully them into kissing the ring. Meanwhile, markets jitter like a chihuahua on cocaine, and trade partners start hedging, divesting, or just pretending America doesn't exist. This is not policy, it's professional wrestling, a WWE monologue delivered with nuclear weapons taped to the back of a folding chair. He wants the tariffs and the GDP growth, the nationalism, and the NASDAQ highs. He wants to breathe fire into the working class rage engine without disturbing Wall Street's cocaine brunch. But here's the unfortunate reality. To his base, tariffs are not economic tools, they're emotional balm. They're proof that someone is finally punching back even if the punch lands in their own face. Trump tells steel workers and farmers in factory towns that he's defending them. What they actually get is higher input costs, fewer exports, job losses, and the economic equivalent of a hangover in a burning house. And the cycle will keep spinning. Tariffs are the political junk food of American policy. Quick, loud, satisfying to chew, and guaranteed to give you heartburn later. From 1789 to now, they've been sold as silver bullets, but they almost always wind up ricocheting into someone's spleen. So here we are, 2025, still addicted to the same old trade fights, still electing men who think diplomacy is a pissing contest and that economic strategy is just yelling America first louder than the last guy. Whether it's Trump tweeting about tariffs from a golf cart or Biden preserving them out of political cowardice, one thing's for sure, tariffs aren't just policy anymore, they're performance art, and we're all paying admission. Conclusion: the tariffs were never for you. 2 centuries of tariff policy teach a very simple lesson. They were never designed for the consumer, the worker, or the small business owner. Tariffs have been the playthings of political elites, tools for financing government, rewarding allies, punishing rivals, and projecting power. From Hamilton's infant industries to Lincoln's war economy, from McKinley's monopolists to Roosevelt's recovery, from post-war liberalization to 21st century trade wars, the story remains consistent. The state picks the winners, the rich get richer, and ordinary people pay the price. So the next time a politician invokes national security, infant industries, or unfair trade practices to justify new duties, remember who truly benefits: those already sitting atop the economic hierarchy. Tariffs are a tax by another name, a levy on your wallet, your job prospects, and your future. Welcome to America, land of the fee, home of the tariff. That's all for your Brainrot News history lesson. Like and subscribe before the Trump administration puts a 200% tariff on the truth.